So, good afternoon, ladies. We're going to be looking at government intervention and failure in the next chapter of the theme 1 booklet, markets, consumers, and firms. And basically, this is about government intervention and failure. So, remember the last narrated PowerPoint that we did, where we covered some of the issues around market failure. Here we're talking specifically about market intervention, and in some cases government intervention, and sometimes how that also might fail. So to sort of start the process, just want you to have a look at a couple of the questions that have been included in the introductory slide. So why does the government intervene in the first place? How can it choose to do that? And will the government's actions ensure that resources are actually allocated efficiently? And that's the sort of question that you might get asked in an exam-based question, and then have to justify your answer with examples, etc. So we're going to look at this in a bit more detail as we go, and hopefully it will make some sense too. Okay, so let's have a look specifically at government intervention and failure. And first and foremost, what is the purpose of intervention? And in most cases, it is, as we mentioned in the previous chapter, to try to address any market failure where a free market has essentially not allocated resources in the most efficient way. We're going to look at some methods of government intervention that they can consider, and that includes regulation. Another form of intervention is legislation, where laws are passed to try to protect or change a certain scenario within a market. It could actually be indirect taxation that they use as a tool. Could also be either grants or subsidies. And again, we'll show how those different types of intervention, number one, might be successful, what limitations they might have, but also we're going to show how they can be presented graphically, so that should you need a diagram to support that, you've got that as an option too. Sometimes it might be voluntary agreements, and we're then going to move on to take a look at government failure and some of the causes of government failure, and they can include the distortion of price signals. So if a free market is intervened with by the government, then in some cases the distortion of price and the signalling function of price that we've covered previously could be somewhat distorted by the government attempt at intervention and the fact that it doesn't quite work as they would have hoped. Clearly there can be unintended consequences, and we'll look at a few examples of those too. And also, any sort of government intervention is by its very nature going to mean that there will be some costs to administrate that, and in some cases those costs are excessive. So those can all be reasons for government failure, in addition to information gaps. We've talked about asymmetric information previously, and where a market or a particular person within a market, whether it's a buyer or a seller, has more information than maybe the government in this instance, that could also be a cause of government failure. We'll then look at government failure in various markets and give some examples of how that might have happened. So first and foremost, then, the purpose. There is an argument that should governments really intervene in markets, and dependent on whether we're truly believing in the power of the free market to allocate resources most effectively. It is a bit of a philosophical discussion, if you like, in terms of whether government should intervene in markets. Should we just leave the market to allocate resources, or should the government actually get involved in some instances? And in some cases there's a very good case for that, and in other cases there are instances when you can think, well, actually that didn't work, so why did they bother in the first place? So let's take a look at some of those things then. So the reasons why governments might intervene could be to reduce market failure, to either reduce or eliminate negative externalities. Now remember, we talked about that in the last presentation. Or it could be to increase or maximise positive externalities. So where we got a positive scenario, where we've got positive benefits, the government might look to enhance those to an even greater extent. But obviously, if we were going to have some negative externality, then in that situation we might try to eliminate or reduce that. It could also be to try to increase the supply of merit goods. We talked briefly about merit and demerit goods, and that's something that we'll come back to again in the future. It could also be to reduce the supply of demerit goods. So if we believe a demerit good like alcohol or tobacco, we might be looking to try and reduce the supply of demerit good because of the negative externalities that might bring. It could well be in some situations where we're trying to supply public goods that would be undersupplied by the market if the free market was just left to its own devices. So in some instances, the government will intervene to try to meet that requirement that maybe the private sector wouldn't do by themselves, because maybe it wouldn't be sufficiently profitable enough to do so. Okay, let's have a look at some of the purposes of government intervention in certain markets then. Now, clearly, in some cases, it might well be that the government is trying to reduce inequalities in the distribution of income and wealth, and clearly that is a very laudable thing to do, and obviously that is going to mean, hopefully, that you're going to get less inequalities and better distribution of income and wealth. Clearly, one of the issues around unequal distribution of income is that can lead to poverty, both mainly in this country it would be relative poverty, where effectively certain people are living below the poverty line. That's basically 60% or less of the median income that a household would earn. And in that situation, clearly, that's going to mean deprivation and, in some cases, maybe a lack of resources to be able to look after your family or whatever. So that's clearly a very good reason why a government might intervene. Obviously, that can create all sorts of issues. That distribution of income being skewed towards the rich, that can cause tensions of all sorts in society, and that obviously can be something that the government will be trying to manage through that whole process. And clearly, in some cases, if that gets to a point where that those tensions keep growing, then we might get a breakdown in society, and obviously that can cause further market failure. So clearly, it's in the government's interest to try to address and intervene in markets where there is a specific inequality in the distribution of income or wealth. There are a couple of links that you can take a look at on child poverty in the UK, and also that will help you to understand a little bit more about the reasons why we might choose to redistribute income to help society and the way in which that can be done. Other reasons for intervention then, it could be to support certain UK industries. So clearly one of the things that the government is attempting to do is to provide an economic environment that provides full employment. That is obviously one of the, or as close to full employment as possible. That is a government target, and clearly in some cases maybe a government will actually intervene in some way to support UK industry to hopefully encourage further employment. And clearly in the situation that we're in at the moment with the pandemic causing all sorts of ructions through the economy, that is probably going to be a very important point that they will be looking to try to influence and address in some shape or form in the future. Clearly, one of the reasons for doing that is that certain industries will be employing large amounts of labour, and that might mean that in some cases the government might intervene to try to encourage those particular employers to employ even more people in order to help that whole process. Other things that the government can do, they can encourage infrastructure and improve infrastructure, in that if we can do that, improve roads, transport, communications, etc., that means that businesses are much likely to be able to provide better quality services. We will then become more nationally and internationally competitive, and clearly in that situation there are very good reasons for doing that, in order for the government to provide a decent environment in order for businesses to flourish in the future. So if we look ahead, do a bit of stargazing, and I'd like to have a think about this as we sort of pause for a moment here. But how do you think the government might intervene in the future? What sorts of things do you think they might need to do? What sort of external shocks are they going to have to try to address and deal with? And draw up a spider diagram of your ideas. So based on where you think the government might intervene and what might be the reasons for them doing that in the future. And I'll give you some time to just complete that, and then we'll carry on with the presentation. Okay, so welcome back. Now we're looking at the ways in which governments might choose to intervene to correct market failure next. So we've moved on slightly from our last point. And there are a number of ways in which governments can intervene to try to correct market failure. If the market hasn't done, or the free market hasn't allocated resources in quite the right way, or there have been some issues where the market structure, the free market structure, just hasn't worked, then there are a number of ways in which the government might choose to intervene. Okay, these can include regulation. We mentioned that previously, and that's essentially putting regulatory bodies in place to say this is the way in which you need to organise yourself as a business within a particular sector. It could well be that the government might actually introduce legislation, so they'll actually introduce a law that actually is attempting to address some form of market failure. Indirect taxation is another way in which the government can, by the use of the taxation system, can try to correct some forms of market failure. And also, as we've mentioned previously in the introductory slide, they might be able to use grants and subsidies to encourage businesses to work within a particular sector, for instance, and to reduce the overall costs of making that decision, if you like, through grants and subsidies. And in some cases, the government might actually encourage some sort of voluntary agreement. So they may not legislate, they may not issue grants or subsidies, but they might agree or get businesses within a particular sector to agree a set of voluntary guidelines, if you like. So let's have a look at each one of those in a bit more detail then. Let's take a look at regulation, and that's essentially where the government will seek to provide effective competition within markets. So in some cases, in most cases, that's what they're attempting to do, okay? So it could well be that a previous industry was either in a monopoly position, or it might have been a nationalised industry, but as and when that becomes a privatised industry, there are in some cases regulation put in place to make sure that the government and those items of regulation are put in place by the government to ensure that they're creating competitive markets, because generally speaking, that's going to improve consumer choice, it's probably going to improve price, and also it's going to allow for better efficiency, both in terms of allocation of resources and also in terms of production efficiencies in those particular markets. In most cases, this is designed to try to protect the interests of consumers so that they're not exploited by firms. In general terms, businesses that have high levels of market share or are in a position where they have some sort of dominance in the market might then choose to do things that are exploiting that position. And in this instance, the government might introduce regulations so that the interests of consumers are protected. If regulation is done effectively, it can lead to, as we mentioned previously, greater choice of products and services within a particular market, and also lower prices, because it's introducing this principle of competition into a market. Happens in a number of industries, most of them that were previously previously nationalised, so the telecoms industry, the water industry and the energy industry have all been fairly recently privatised, and one of the issues around that is to make sure that the regulation actually ensures that each of those industries is actually working in the public interest and not against the public interest. Other reasons for increasing increasing the use of regulation is to try to create conditions where you've got high levels of investment in infrastructure in important areas of the economy. So effectively what the government is trying to do is to provide an environment, a stable economic environment that is going to allow us as businesses and as industries to be able to be more competitive, and some of those areas of regulation and also investment will be down to trying to improve that overall position. Okay, so the next thing is legislation then. So we talked about regulation. Legislation, I suppose, is the next stage on from regulation. And that's where effectively laws can be created or enacted to protect individuals, firms, and society as a whole. All sorts of areas that the government might get involved in as far as this is concerned, but in this instance, we're looking at legislation that's going to have an impact on the activities of organisations. Okay, so the whole process involves laws being passed through UK Acts of Parliament, but also to some degree, certainly until fairly recently, we've been subject to EU laws, and I think we probably still will be to some degree, although obviously with Brexit and the change in some of those EU laws, that might become a less onerous process. And an example, a typical example of a legislative change would be Sunday trading hours as an example, but also the levels of environmental pollution and those things that are legislated for in order to make sure that people, businesses, and parts of society actually work within the legal framework that's been provided. Well, if we take a look at legislation then, and in some cases a lot of economic legislation tends to be down to price controls, and this is where the government will basically try to set either a maximum or a minimum price for a good or a service. So a very good example of that would be the minimum wage in the UK. So if we take the situation here where we've got a graph drawn as price and quantity, and in this scenario here, we're suggesting that a minimum price would be set at P1. So you can see the minimum price would be set at P1, okay, and that would lead to an excess supply of Q1, an excess supply of Q1 to Q2. So from Q1 to Q2, as firms wish to supply more goods at that higher price. Now, in this situation, so as an example, the national minimum wage was introduced by the Labour government back in 1999, and the whole principle behind that was in an attempt to actually redistribute some income to lower paid workers. So essentially, raising the national minimum wage was about trying to address some of these issues of income inequality and distribution of income. Now, in some instances, it was believed that some commentators believed that the demand for workers would be lower than the equilibrium level, and there would be an excess supply of labour. But in this instance, we can see that where we've actually increased the price, in this instance, we've got a higher level of supply, and that's because obviously in this instance, both the demand and supply and the equilibrium point has shifted sufficiently to allow for that to happen. But typically, the type of legislation that a government is going to likely to be looking at is something like maximum or minimum prices. Okay, so if we then take a look at a maximum price then, so in this situation, we've got a maximum price at P1, so that's basically being imposed by the government in this instance, and that's going to lead to excess demand from Q1 to Q2, and as a result of that, consumers will wish to demand more at a lower price, so say at P1. Okay, so in this instance, if that were to happen, then clearly that would be influencing the market to some degree. But it may well be that the government might choose to impose a maximum price to prevent the consumer from being exploited. So in some cases, the government might say this is the highest price that you can charge, and as a result of that, that would be effectively attempting to control the market to some degree and to reduce exploitation of, in this case, consumers. So that's legislation. Let's look at indirect taxation then. So in this instance, what we're saying is that taxation can be used by the government to finance both their spending, but also to some degree to control the economy. And basically, taxation is a charge that's imposed on products, individuals, and businesses. Now, there are a number of different types of taxes. There's an indirect tax, which is basically a tax on a good or a service, or there's a direct tax, which is that is imposed upon an individual or an organisation. Okay, so the incidence or burden of tax is the amount that either the consumer or the producer will pay for that tax. Okay, so if we take this situation as we've got it shown here, let's just explain how this works in terms of the diagram that's drawn and also what's going on within it. So you can see the situation as it stands at the moment, and in this situation, our supply S is the typical supply curve drawn in there, but in this instance, if there is a tax imposed, then effectively that tax is going to have to be added to the cost of supply or the cost of production, and in essence it's going to make it more expensive to supply goods and services, and as a result of that, output may actually reduce. So in this case, the imposition of the indirect tax will lead to an increase in cost of supply, as you can see here, and that will shift the supply curve from S up to S with tax. Okay, that's going to mean essentially you're going to get the quantities being supplied will be a lower amount, and the other. So in this instance, we will be producing at Q1 rather than Q. And in that instance too, we would have a change in price too. So P would rise from P to P1. In that situation, that increase in tax has caused the price to rise by the vertical distance between the supply curves, as you can see. But the incidence, as we mentioned before, the amount of tax paid for by the producer is shown by the blue line, P0 to P. And then the incidence of tax that would be paid by the consumer would be the green line, which is shown as P1 minus P. Okay, so in that situation, that indirect tax, to some degree, some of it will be paid for by the producer, and then obviously some of it is clearly going to also be paid for by the consumer. So that's basically our indirect tax. We then take a look at specific tax or ad valorem tax, okay, which are two slightly different things. We've got a specific tax, which is a set amount per unit. So, for instance, a tax of 50p, which might be a sugar tax on each fizzy drink. But you've also got an ad valorem tax, which is basically the percentage of the price. It's a percentage of the price of the good or service, and so therefore the more expensive the product is, the greater the tax that's levied on it. So if we take the first example, the specific tax is going to lead to a parallel shift in the supply curve, as shown in the top diagram on the left hand side. So again, not dissimilar to the one that we just taken a look at, but in this instance the tax that is being imposed by the government is going to cause supply to shift. It's going to make supply more expensive, and as a result of that, businesses will choose to supply less, and as a result of that, demand will also change. If we take the ad valorem tax then, where we've got this shift, we're still going to get this shift, but clearly, based on the fact that it's a percentage of the value of the good or service. As the good or service becomes more expensive, then clearly we're going to get that tilt away from the parallel line. So we've still got this tax burden, but the price and as the price increases, as so will the tax. So that's to do with taxes and taxation and how the government might choose to use them, but they can also choose to use grants or subsidies. And effectively what we're doing here is the government is offering incentives for producers to actually supply goods or services. So in this scenario, we've got the original supply at S, and then the subsidy, the grant, or the subsidy that is provided is essentially reducing the overall cost of production, and so as a result of that, the level of supply would be increased based on moving out to the right and downward with the downward shift. Okay, so effectively, that is going to cause a decrease in the cost of supply for a firm. That's going to, again, as mentioned before, going to move the supply curve down, and the quantity supplied will increase from Q to Q1. So this essentially would mean that more quantity would be demanded at that cheaper price because of the subsidy or the grant that the government would be offering. And that clearly is going to mean that in this instance, you've got a shift, you've got a move from one level of supply to another level of supply. And again, we've got this subsidy that will be shared both by the consumer and the producer. It will be shared by the consumer in terms of getting a slightly cheaper price, but also the producer will also be able to produce that good at a cheaper level. Now, when we take a look at grants and subsidies, then what we've tried to do here is demonstrate that the gain, what the gain for consumers and producers are, what the incidence of subsidy is for the government, and also the government expenditure on that particular subsidy. Okay, so in each instance, if we take the gain to consumers, basically we're talking about the area from E, F, G to J. Okay, so that's the area between the actual price that is being charged at equilibrium at Q1 and the gain that consumers are going to get over and above that. Okay, the second example, the gain to producers, is the area GHIJ, and again, that's the point at which producers would be willing to produce, but can actually, because they're charging at this new price, at this equilibrium price of Q1, they are actually going to get some overall benefit to that, some sort of gain as a result. The incidence of subsidy on government is the area F to H. Okay, so effectively, the government's subsidy has essentially caused that shift. Okay, and then clearly the actual expenditure on the overall subsidy is covered by the area E, F, H, I. Okay, so that just gives you an idea of how those gains actually break down. There's a quick test for you then to take a look at some of the stuff that we've done so far in the presentation, and obviously you can take a look at your booklet, your chapter 18 in the booklet, which runs from page 92 through to page 97, and there is a quick test for you to test your understanding. Okay, to look at the question and then decide which area is showing, in this case, a subsidy. Other questions you might like to consider, given the type of area that we've been looking at today, would be questions of this nature, and some of these questions you could actually use as a basis for testing your understanding too. Okay, so to what extent can regulations be used to correct market failure in the fast food industry? That's maybe something that you could give some thought to. To what extent is the provision of information through health warnings on cigarettes the most effective way to correct market failure in this industry? Well, you could say that certainly would help, and that would help to correct market failure, but maybe there are other instances, other things that a government might choose to do to actually address market failure, in this case in the tobacco industry. Another sort of example of the type of question you might get asked: discuss the extent to which subsidy of producers of organic fruit and vegetables might increase their consumption, thus generating positive externalities. So, got one instance where we're talking about some sort of government intervention, in this case a subsidy, how that might increase the consumption of merit goods, organic fruit and vegetables, and how that might then increase and generate positive externalities. Other examples, questions, discussing the extent to which pollution permits might be the most effective way of correcting market failure caused by CO2 emissions, aircraft travel and indirect taxes, and how that might actually address the problem of aircraft travel and aircraft emissions, the extent to which all healthcare should be provided privately. Again, there are all sorts of arguments and discussions that you could have about that. Okay. Now, one of the things to try and do in this situation, and the reason why we sort of spent a bit of time discussing it, is that the use of diagrams to help illustrate your answer. If we're talking about different forms of government intervention and how successful they might be, then clearly, if you're going to talk about that, understanding these diagrams and making sure you're comfortable with the diagrams and what they mean is going to make a big difference to the way in which you're going to score in your tests and assessments. So it's something to really bear in mind, okay? And to really try and get your head around. Okay, so let's have a look at government failure in a bit more detail then, okay? And this is essentially where the government's tried to intervene and has been unsuccessful for whatever reason, okay? So in this case, if that does happen, if there's government failure, essentially you're going to lead to what's known as a net welfare loss in comparison to allowing the free market to operate by itself. So effectively, if the government's interventions fail, then that's going to cause the situation to be even worse than it would have been before the free market had sort of tried to allocate resources. Okay. Now, clearly, if that happens to some degree and government failure happens, then the argument is that that's going to create even greater market distortion, and to some degree that will lead to even greater allocative inefficiency in terms of the way in which resources are allocated. So, in that situation, if that did happen, economic welfare would be further reduced, and then we would have a situation where there would be a net welfare loss, i.e. consumer benefit or welfare loss would be greater than, the consumer, the loss of consumer welfare would be even greater. So how does it happen? Well, in some cases, government failure is going to be caused by resources being allocated in an incorrect way, and that's going to cause an even greater problem in terms of the market failing to allocate resources in an efficient way. There is a law of unintended consequences, which essentially is where the government has actually, there's been a range of things that have happened as a result of the government intervention that they couldn't necessarily have predicted, and obviously there's going to cause an even greater problem. It can happen for a number of reasons. In some cases, it might be inadequate information on the part of the government. They're trying to do things in the hope that they're going to make a difference, but actually without the full facts and figures, that might not necessarily be a successful scenario. In some cases, it can happen because the government is always facing conflicting objectives, whether you're talking about economic growth or inflation or employment or a whole range of other objectives. You're always going to be faced with, certainly as a government, trying to meet a number of different conflicting objectives. And in some cases, if you try to address one area, that's then going to affect another area in a negative way. And obviously that can sometimes be a bit of an issue. The other thing to bear in mind is some of the administrative costs. So if the government tries to get involved in improving a scenario, then clearly there is going to be some admin costs. There's going to be a number of things that they will need to bear in mind that will add to cost, and that clearly can be another reason for, in some cases, much as they might have had the best of intentions, the poor allocation or the inefficient allocation of resources is going to become even less so on that basis. So the other thing to bear in mind is that to some degree, some of the things that might happen if we get this government intervention, in some cases it can distort certain things. So for instance, if a government tries to create incentives or disincentives in order to influence the behaviour of firms and businesses, that might well work, but one of the issues can be that it may well be that could help to create markets that would not survive in their present situation without government support. And as soon as we get the situation where government support is sort of expected and is helping or managing or mismanaging the market, that clearly becomes a fairly significant issue. Okay, and that obviously, if we get involved in that sort of a process, that's going to distort the free workings of the market, and that's going to create distorted prices within markets, and that clearly is going to cause an issue in terms of how efficient the allocation of resources will be. And clearly, in some cases, that might, much as the government has been trying to actually address some of the inefficiencies, it might actually increase them or create more rather than actually correcting them, which again was what they were intending in the first instance. Administrative costs, we've mentioned that already. One of the issues can mean that the benefits derived from any intervention could be outweighed by the extra cost. And clearly, in some cases, when the government is trying to put in place a new set of measures, in some cases the bureaucracy that's involved in that can lead to higher costs, and that again can clearly distort the market and cause some form of market failure. One of the other issues around that is that clearly in some cases, the government hasn't got a bottomless pit to just keep throwing money at certain scenarios, and in some cases where there are constrained budgets, that can also add to the problems, particularly when we're talking about times of recession. Clearly, decisions have to be prioritised based on where best to spend the money, and in some cases there are incorrect decisions are made, and in some cases the costs don't necessarily achieve the expected benefits, which obviously is just going to pile up more and more problems and create more potential market failure or distortion in the free market. Okay. Let's take a look at information gaps next then, and in this instance clearly the government might be trying to improve the scenario, but in some cases may lack perfect knowledge, or there may be an asymmetric information distribution, and in that case clearly that's not going to help. So in that situation, ideally what we want is information that's going to ensure economic units that can maximise their decisions when consuming and producing goods and services, and the government will provide information where the private sector fails to do so. However, when we're talking about where they might find that information, from the job market, from dangerous products, and maybe the research into cigarettes and the cigarette-related illnesses or tobacco-related illnesses, economic data from the firms that will help firms to plan in the future. But in some cases, some of the data that the government is using can either be inaccurate due to poor research, or some external shocks maybe not being particularly easy to predict, and how that might actually affect the overall workings of the free market. In some instances, clearly that might mean that the government, much as with the best of intentions, they may not necessarily provide the correct information. They might send the wrong signals to the market, and that could mean that decision making based on what is essentially flawed data in the first place might actually cause more problems than it actually solves. Okay, so examples of government failure in various markets then. To what extent is there a government failure in these examples? There are a few examples for you to take a look at. There's a film and a couple of articles. I want you to take a look at those and take some notes on those in order that you, again, have got that information in your locker to be able to then explain and use as examples should you be asked any questions on the government failure in various markets. Okay. So again, a question to think about. To what extent is government intervention necessary to improve the economic welfare of society as a whole? Now, again, dependent on the position that you take in terms of whether you believe that the free market should do that, maybe there are instances when government intervention is necessary to ensure that we, as a whole society, get a fair crack of the whip, and that could be down to things like distribution of income, redistribution of income through the tax system, or a whole range of other things. And in some instances, one could argue that the private costs that businesses and individuals may actually consider, sometimes maybe the social cost and also the social benefit aren't necessarily considered, and maybe that's where government intervention comes in, and why a mixed economy might work better than either a complete command economy or a completely free market. So thank you for listening. That concludes this presentation. Hopefully it's made some sense, and what I'll do is I'll post this onto Teams, and that will allow you to take a look at that and spend some time over the next couple of lessons just making sure that you understand that content. So I'll catch up with you soon. Thanks.